Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us today. This is the National Civic League's January Promising Practices webinar, Tackling Tough Issues Through Citizen Panels. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the Program Director of the All-America City Awards and Communications here at the National Civic League. For those of you less familiar with the League, we are a 125-year-old nonprofit, and we aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. One of the primary ways that we do that is through our flagship All-America City Award program. The program began in 1949, and it was really about recognizing and celebrating local examples of the civic engagement accomplishments. So we use our annual award program to really unearth those communities that are doing great work. And then we use this webinar series to share those ideas as well as additional resources and programs that can help enable a community's civic engagement work. So before we start today, just a quick shout out to the 2022 All-America City Award winners here that you see on your screen. In 2022, we partnered with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. So all of the wonderful communities that you see on your screen here today, but we're really recognized for their efforts to use housing as a platform to promote equitable learning recovery and early school success. So you can read about their great work on our website and even watch their presentations. In this coming year, we are excited to be focusing our award program on youth engagement, creating thriving communities through youth engagement. You can see some ideas for potential projects here on your screen. We have a number of communities that are well on their way to applying this year. There is still time to begin working on your application. Those are due February 15th, so that is coming up quickly. But if you're at all interested in having your youth engagement efforts recognized, please consider applying, and I'll include some information about that in my follow-up email. And it's topical today to be talking about lottery selected panels, because the All-America City Award is all about civic engagement, all about how communities can get residents more involved in the process, and the lottery selected panel process through Healthy Democracy is just a great way to do that. And so we're joined here today by Alex Ranieri and Lynn Davis, who are program co-directors. They're going to talk to us all about that process, applications, and benefits of the lottery selected panel process. And then we have two individuals who have been deeply involved in their community's use of the process. We have Peggy Flynn, who's a city manager with Petaluma, California, and then Jose Melendez, who is a panelist on the Eugene review panel. So excited to hand it over to them. Before I do, just a few housekeeping items. I do ask that everybody remain muted out of respect for our speakers. We will have a Q&A period at the very end of the webinar. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, and then you can also use the raise hand feature at the very end. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive that recording as well as the slides and any additional resources that our speakers mentioned throughout the webinar. You'll receive that in an email tomorrow. And with that, I am excited to hand it off to Alex. Alex, can you get us started?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. My name is Alex Ranieri, Program Co-Director with Healthy Democracy. Extremely happy to be here with all of you today to talk about tackling tough issues with lottery selected panels. Right, so first, by way of introduction, Healthy Democracy, we're a small, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's based here in Oregon, but we work all across the United States. We use democratic lotteries to bring new voices into decision-making and guarantee representation in our democracy across many diversities. We design deliberative processes that prove a more collaborative politics is possible. And we do this by partnering with local governments, many of the kinds of folks in this room, nonprofits, and really any other entity that wants to do better, more robust decision making. So we bring lottery selected panels to tackle policy questions on anything under the sun, from housing to healthcare. So first, a little bit of context, why we do the work that we do. First of all, many of us in the US don't see ourselves represented in our democracy. When we look at rates of participation in civic and political activities across income brackets, we see that folks with higher socioeconomic status participate at disproportionately high rates. When we look at those same data for racial groups, we see that white folks participate at disproportionately high rates. And these point to just a massive disparity in who has access to public decision-making in this country. Secondly, we don't see public decision-making as something that we all can do. So public processes are mostly built for a select few, right? They assume familiarity and comfort, a very specific way of interacting, often in our public meetings. That looks like Robert's Rules of Order. They undervalue lived experience quite a bit, and they're debate-oriented, not collaboration-oriented. So everybody's yelling, but no one's really listening to each other. No surprise, all of this has huge consequences for the political system in which we live. Rates of dissatisfaction with democracy in the US have been on the rise for the last 30 years. Obviously, this comes as no surprise. In the last couple of years, that's mounting higher. And we believe that in order to counteract these really frightening trends, we must make upgrades to our democracy and our democratic infrastructure that actually work for more people. So one of those upgrades, what we'll be talking about today, are lottery selected panels. So we envision a democracy where our public decision-making reflects our many diversities, where everyone participates not just in thin things like voting, but thick democracy, really in-depth policymaking, where expertise is both valued and critically questioned, and where government is not just an entity, but a tool that we all use together. So lottery selected panels have two core kind of components that we'll keep coming back to. There's the who's in the room on the left side and what happens in the room on the right side. So first, democratic lotteries are how we bring folks into the room. They guarantee representation in decision-making. Panelists are lottery selected in a process that's both random and representative to reflect 7 or more demographic factors in the community. And then they're paid to participate, so really substantively supported to participate in a process. And what happens in the room? In-depth deliberation fundamentally changes the decision-making process. So panelists learn together, they consider a wide range of information and perspectives, and then collaboratively write policy recommendations. Okay, so now we're going to take a deep dive into these two components, a little bit more on who's in the room, what the democratic lottery process looks like. So most of our civic engagement opportunities currently kind of fall into one of these two democracy pie slices, if you will. So processes that are open to anyone. This involves things like voting, showing up to a city council meeting, public workshop, or processes that are by specific invitation. And we think there's a key piece missing to this democracy pie, which is lottery selection. The better metaphor, however, is more democracy pies. We don't need to divvy up the same pie. We can have all these kinds of approaches to bringing folks into a more inclusive democracy. And they all have really their benefits and drawbacks. So processes that are open to anyone, absolutely essential for participatory governance. They're super inclusive, at least in theory, but we often see the same individuals participating again and again, and they're thinner, like I talked about before. Specific invitation, absolutely essential for specific outreach to stakeholder communities that will be more impacted by a policy topic, especially important for outreach to marginalized populations. However, we often still hear from the same kind of leaders within those communities, the same individuals, and there's a more top-down orientation. So lottery selection, just one other approach that we can use in our toolbox. Guarantees new voices in the room and more diverse folks, and gives space for really in-depth deliberative policymaking. So the lottery process is broken down into these three kind of main steps. An invitation mailer is sent out, so we partner, and I should say that these processes are being used all around the world, often called citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries. Lynn will talk a little bit more about that later. But this is standard procedure for any civic or democratic lottery process. We make a partnership with often a government and send out an invitation mailer to often 10 to 15,000 randomly selected residential addresses. And often these are folks who've never participated in a similar process before. We use census data or other demographic data to kind of set demographic targets. So age, race and ethnicity, income level, educational attainment, gender, and sometimes others, to set the criteria for what representation on the panel will look like. And then we hold a public selection event that selects a panel that's both random and representative of all those demographic targets. And what's really key to these processes too is that we're reducing barriers to participation that many communities face. So we're covering the costs of participation, both through a stipend and by reimbursing for things like child elder care. We provide one-on-one direct panelist support so folks feel more comfortable in the space who maybe have never done something like this before. And then provide comprehensive language access services. So this graph kind of breaks down why a democratic lottery is so essential for getting better representation. If we look at the first row, this is from the Eugene review panel, a process we did a couple years ago that Jose will talk more about. The left-hand pie chart is the general population of Eugene. So predominantly white, about 2/3 white. If we look at who responds to the mailing, so this is the self-selection bias, disproportionately high rate of white folks responded or self-selected to participate. We run the democratic lottery, and the panel is the third pie chart in that upper row. So we are actually as diverse or more than the general population. In this case, we used K through 12 demographics instead of the census. And so it was a little bit more than the general population in Eugene. So all of this, and we get what looks like a city in one virtual room, or a state in one real room. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lynn to take our second half.
Thanks, Alex, and hi, everyone. So great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens in the room, which is equally sort of important as a new kind of methodology. Next. The deliberative process has several key components. First, it starts with a well-balanced group of background experts and stakeholders that are chosen through another democratic process pre-existing the panel that we can talk about later. Panelists then deliberate on this massive quantity of information, and they go out and do their own research. They sort through all the different values concerned here and go through an iterative process to consider different policy options. They then start to write those policy options and recommendations eventually themselves. Importantly here, always entirely in the panelists' own words. That's a really key part of these kind of processes, and that they deliver them directly to decision makers, that they're not mediated by us or by staff or anyone else. Another core component of these processes is often to have feedback loops with decision makers or staff to get feedback on as they're going through the process, ideally at several points. Now, next. So this is just a little bit of an overview of the whole process. The first two bubbles here are the lottery. We send out the invitation, folks respond. Then there's that random but representative lottery selection event. And then the latter three here are the deliberative process, first starting with this really robust information gathering phase that really builds cohesion on the panel around this shared goal of gathering the best quality information, going into structured and intensive deliberation and many, many different iterative kind of steps and combinations, coming out with really detailed recommendations. So I want to talk through some of the high level sort of principles behind these kind of programs. First, inclusivity. A core part is the proactive recruitment, the fact that we're reaching out to folks at their own address and saying, you have been randomly selected should you decide to respond. And that they're accessibility driven at every stage from that initial letter all the way through the entire process. That results in new voices. They also guarantee representation, as we've mentioned a few times, on a number of different diversities all at the same time, which is a really incredible and unusual sight for most of us who have worked in government. They also are, we hope, come with a lot of integrity, that they're research-based in their design, and going back several decades, the research is quite robust, that they're transparent, except to protect the privacy of individual panelists, and that they are always independently evaluated by someone who's not paid by the project, ideally academics. They're also, as Alex mentioned, collaborative from the ground up. The architecture is built differently than what we see in the rest of our politics. So it's a structure that is iterative, that's professionally moderated, and that results in this respectful, evidence-driven exchange that is a sea change from what we usually see. And finally, the panelists are empowered. This is absolutely key, that the panel, even in a small ad hoc process, has as much authority as possible over its own process, and certainly 100% of its authority over its own content. And that it has the ability to actually influence real policy. As Alex mentioned, this is part of a much bigger international movement all across the world. And this has especially taken off in the last decade or so. On all continents, these are happening at pretty much every scale, from the city to national level projects in several countries. And that this has really taken off. And it's particularly taken off on, at least at the beginning, on issues that are really dicey, high stakes, contentious, the most complex and technical and divisive kind of topics. Now, they can be used on all kinds of things. Lottery selected bodies sometimes replace existing boards or commissions or act in addition to another governmental system in a permanent way. But they're often first used on a one-time basis on something that is a lose-lose situation for everybody else, or where the current sort of democratic system is likely to have a poor result. So this is a survey from our most recent panel done by the researchers for that panel. And it surveyed panelists on at the end of their about 90 hours of deliberation together. And as you can see here, a vast majority said that they believed that even people who strongly disagree can make sound decisions together if they sit and talk. All but 8% of the panel felt that way, which that alone is an incredible development. Another sort of piece of evidence we think about the ability for these kinds of processes to handle the very toughest questions is that the results that come from these panels often result in actual policy. They don't sit on a shelf. You can see here the bottom two rows of this bar chart, a little bit hard to see. This is from a report from the OECD that shows that in about 2/3 of cases, those two bars taken together, at least 50% of the recommendations made by panels were taken up by policymakers. And that both points to, I think, the quality of the recommendations, but also to the decision by elected officials and staff to take on one of these projects. Sort of in taking one of these on, there is sort of to some extent, a sharing of responsibility, a level of gravity that is then afforded to the panel, and a level of trust that flows both ways between the panel and public officials that produces a more productive policy outcome. So just to finish off with a few sort of core benefits, we think these processes foster ownership over public decision-making, as I just mentioned, and enhance that mutual trust, not just trust in government, but mutual trust. That they boost diversity in civic participation, that they increase access for historically marginalized groups and guarantee that access, that they promote evidence-driven public discourse, showcase this more cooperative politics that's foundationally built that way, that they surface previously untapped ideas and encourage effective policy co-production in an environment where so often that is impossible because, as Alex mentioned, we are both socialized into and designed into systems that mainly are about us going at each other. And just finally, these processes, although they've taken off in a much bigger way, for example, in Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, some other places, they've been around in the US for about 50 years, and they are growing slowly here as well. And just over on the left-hand column there, this is a report by Pew a couple of years ago that showed that about 79% of Americans feel that citizen assemblies, in their words here, are very valuable potential processes. And that's actually higher than some other countries on the list here that have a lot more of these processes going right now. I think with that, we'll leave it there. I'm going to turn it over to Peggy and then Jose to talk more about these specific processes in Petaluma and Eugene. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. I don't have a slide deck because I think just the story of everything that Alex and Lynn just talked about, we experienced in practice here in Petaluma and at a very extensive level. My name is Peggy Flynn. I am the city manager of Petaluma, California. It's located in Northern California, north of San Francisco. We have about 60,000 residents, primarily white, but we have a 23% Latinx population. And I've been the city manager here since 2019. And one of the largest, most contentious, complex, I forgot, Alex, what did you say? Technical, all those, it met all the criteria. Topics that we needed to face as a community is what to do with 55 acres in the center of our city that had been leased to the Fair Board for the last 50 years. The lease is set to expire at the end of 2023. And it has been a point of contention for decades among the community about what to do with the property. And I was fortunate enough, and I call it kismet, fate, universe conspiring for us to have met Lynn at a Cal Cities conference where he was talking about this process and what participatory governance looks like, these panels. And as I was sitting hearing about this amazing resource, I thought, wow, I've been in city government for 3 decades and have done many different ways of trying to get folks to come to the table and engage our community. And yet we still see the same faces. And council makes its decision based on the people that they hear from. And what if we did something novel by adding that third part of the pie? And so reached out to Lynn, and we set on a course of creating a lottery selected 36-person panel, reaching out to 10,000 residents in Petaluma, over selecting for certain demographics that we typically don't hear and hear from in our engagement processes. We actually chose our K through 12 demographics because it had a higher diversity than city demographics. And so really try to over select for that and set off on this panel process, which both I think from the community and from the council's perspective was not only novel, but like, how is this going to work? And how is this going to factor into our decision making? And we did it for a variety of reasons, not just that it was a novel approach, but because this was such a beloved community resource, and it was run by the fair, which was a 5-day fair. It's a 5-day fair that is run on this 55-acre parcel for 5 days out of the year. And then the rest of the year has various community events and things that the fair does to raise money for the fair. That we didn't want it to be a staff-driven process. We wanted our residents to see themselves in local decision-making. We wanted our folks to be represented that don't typically participate in local government. And we wanted some leadership development. You know, it's everybody can probably appreciate on this webinar that how difficult it is to find folks for your committees and commissions, to get people to participate, to provide that meaningful, informed, you know, participation that's going to benefit your council members when they're making their decision. So we had the 36, we seated the 36 panelists. Again, a microcosm of the city in terms of age, gender, race, ethnicity, geographic location of residence, experience of a disability, housing status, educational attainment. And then we prioritized equity in the selection process. Demographic targets were based on our K-12 age population, oversampled some groups who have previously been underrepresented in our city processes like general plan. And then the process just took our engagement to a new level. We were already planning a very robust process. The panelists were paid a stipend, $20 an hour for their time participating in the process, provided with accommodations they needed to fully participate, child, elder care, transportation costs, laptops, so technology was really key, tech support, language access, interpretation, translation. And their deliverable was to create reports to present to council in July. And so they met for, and Alex remind me, but it was over like 3 months, but on weekends, over weekends when people can actually participate. So I don't remember how many hours we had, but
About 90.
About 90. Yeah. So it was pretty significant, and they really got to drill down and create their own process of how to get these reports together, and chose the folks that they wanted to interview. And again, not a staff-driven process. So sessions were held May, June, July. We had recordings of all the panel sessions. They were available immediately. Healthy Democracy was amazing. Talk about transparency in the process. It was from the selection process throughout the process. It was very transparent. Anybody could watch both online and in person. And after the panel, so the panel did deliver its recommendations to our decision makers in July, but it didn't stop there. Panelists were also funded for an additional 15 hours to continue to engage with the community and decision makers about the recommendations, because people wanted to really know more about this. Like, well, how did you come to this? And what did you mean by this? So throughout the summer, the subcommittees of the panel met with the community organizations and city staff, spoke with their media, evaluated the panel process, hosted a charrette-style workshop with local architects to visualize the recommendations, which then were presented to our council this October, when council was going to make a decision on how we were going to move forward in making a decision on the fairgrounds. It was unanimous council. It was a long meeting. We had a lot of people show up, but the panelists and the panelists were there. A majority of the panelists were there, and they stayed with us throughout the whole process, and so proud of just their dedication and their commitment, and council unanimously approved adopting the panel's recommendations as guidelines for staff to negotiate a new agreement with the fair, as well as all master planning efforts in the future, that those recommendations would be reflected as guiding principles in the way we approach the project. So it was an incredible experience. It wasn't without its bumps along the road, mostly because we'd never done it before. This is so new, and for staff not to drive an engagement process was very foreign to my staff and to myself. And so just bringing our electeds along and trusting the process was always challenging, but they believed in it, and we're really thrilled that we went down that road. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Peggy, for that. And I think that I will round out the panelists here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Melendez, and I was a member of the Middle Housing Review Panel in Oregon, in the city of Eugene. I was also a member of the process committee for the panel, which reviews surveys conducted after every session to see how the experience was going. The Middle Housing Panel was one of the city of Eugene's public engagement efforts to decide what zoning changes to implement in relation to statewide mandates. I want to highlight two things that distinguish the review panels from others. As members of the public, panelists speak for how a policy decision would impact them. They are not speaking as representatives of groups, such as those typically found in other types of public engagement scenarios, where, for example, individuals from nonprofits or interest groups speak for a collective. Additionally, members of the Middle Housing Panel were your average residents. We were or are not the loudest people in the room. We are not the type to bully decision makers through emails or try to engage in discussions of the public good through private channels. We did our work diligently and respectfully and with great pride. As such, when in the past commissioners or other cities as staff or others at city staff wish that they could hear from members of the public directly who are not your typical participants, the panel members were indeed those voices. Back in 2020, when I received a mailing to place my name in the lot from which participants would be chosen to sit on the Middle Housing Panel, I had only lived in Eugene for 2 years and was a renter. I recalled how before our move in 2018 to Eugene, my partner and I had difficulties finding housing that was affordable. Thus, the mailing piqued my interest to participate in a process that could help guide the city on addressing such a fundamental problem. I also realized that as a new resident to the city, I had yet to civically engage locally, and this was an opportunity to do so while meeting other residents as one of their peers. Once I was elected, I was impressed with the number of resources that the city had made available to Healthy Democracy, the managing organization it had contracted to design and run the process. The staff of Healthy Democracy contacted me for a consultation that included whether I needed a loaner laptop, internet hotspot, a tutorial with using Zoom, in addition to ensuring that I understood that given the amount of time commitment the panel required of participants, that I would receive a stipend. I was struck by the amount of attention that was provided before the face-to-face virtual meetings began to ensure that panelists had the tools and means to effectively participate. Over the course of 15 meetings over 6 months, the 29 panelists' work was divided into 3 phases: education and learning of the topic that was the focus of the panel. This was a joint onboarding experience that created a foundation of knowledge that we could all pull from in our subsequent work. This orientation to the issue of middle housing set this process apart from your typical survey. Respondent who may spend 15 to 20 minutes filling out a survey, but most likely without the hours of education on the background of the issue. The second phase was deliberation among panelists on how we understood the problem and what our guiding principles should be to the city planners as they drafted the new zoning codes. And then finally, we engaged in policy recommendations, which in the Eugene process meant voting on each of the draft codes that the city had come up with using our guiding principles. Across several months, I was effective with my fellow panelists as we spent time getting to know one another and working together. During this time, I came to learn about the various socioeconomic backgrounds represented on the panel, ranging from high school age to senior citizens, high school education level to a PhD, which included renters and owners. They also were representative of the racial ethnic diversity of Eugene, disability status, English fluency, sexual orientation. Across these differences, what stood out was that every one of us showed up for the required sessions. We were ready to learn, listen, reflect, and problem solve for the purpose of helping alleviate a problem that made finding a safe, affordable home something that is more and more out of reach for many residents in Eugene, especially for those who are not well off. It was clear from the very beginning that no one on the panel, including myself, was an expert on housing policy. That was okay, since it was obvious that this process was not meant for experts, but for the average resident who was not your typical city political usual suspect, and yet needed to be consulted on a policy change. The design of the middle housing panel supported the engagement of non-experts, which included hearing and questioning content experts, then thinking out loud in smaller groups to make sense of that content before reporting back to the whole group, and concluding by working through disagreements and coming up with guiding principles and recommendations. Additionally, it was also clear that the panel was not about numbers, having the most amount of people involved, given how the task was in-depth deliberation that required facilitation and small group interactions. I was heartened to see other immigrants and people of color make sense of our task in small groups, or even when one of our elderly participants shared how she was going through chemo treatment while participating. Yeah, there she was, there we were, showing up and doing the hard work that we had been selected to do, and that towards the end, we had achieved a sense of community defined by the purpose of our work. My experience wasn't perfect, but it was much better than I had ever expected going into it. If I were to make recommendations for other jurisdictions who go through this, I would suggest that more time be allocated for actual deliberation, for individuals to have multiple opportunities to go back and forth as opposed to just one time. There's also a need to design or plan for what comes after the work of the panel is done. This includes an advocacy plan to engage with decision makers and the public, a public education plan on the panel's recommendations, and concerted efforts by jurisdictions to keep the panelists engaged with one another, maintain the relationships that the civic engagement and investment is not a one-shot deal, but becomes a well for future participants. There's also a need to plan for how to mitigate the politics of the topic that the panel is working on from outside influence. This is difficult. This is a difficult task, but the more jurisdictions can mitigate outside influences from intimidating, confusing, or silencing the panel, the lower the risk of this running afoul. Finally, I will share that I happen to be a professor of planning at the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon, with a research focus on the design of decision-making processes. In particular, for processes that include members from underrepresented communities. I did not participate in this panel as an expert, but as a Latino immigrant member of the public who happened to be a renter at that time. It was a highly rewarding experience to get to know so many other residents of Eugene over so many months of meaningful work together. I was amazed by how the panel hit so many of the qualities that are considered positive engagement practices in the research literature on this topic. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but nevertheless, given how challenged other more well-known public engagement processes are, I do recommend jurisdictions to experiment with this democratic innovation. As a professor who studies these design, I could also observe what was happening as quite meaningful, not only in relation to content and policy, but also how individually and collectively we were developing an identity of average residents who could tackle complex problems and had a right to be consulted just as much as the usual suspects. I will end by saying that there are 3 ways in which the middle housing panel aligned with my own analytical and design framework for decision-making processes. One is that the middle housing panel in Eugene focused on designing a very detailed process over time, which means paying attention to the time series sequencing of the different phases of the engagement. So selection, background education, deliberation, policy recommendations, decision makings, etc. They also spend a lot of time in figuring out the design of the supporting bureaucracy in order to make the process successful. That means figuring out all the resources requiring for the process, from staff, budget, materials that are needed to support the work, etc. And finally, they pay great attention to the learning environments, or what we refer to as the face-to-face interaction. That is indeed paying attention to the small and large details that matter in relation to achieving the expected learning outcomes. You need to pay attention to all three planes for things to happen, for things to hopefully work well together. I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jose, Peggy, Lynn, and Alex. Appreciate you giving us the overview of the concept up front, Alex and Lynn, and then of course those just on the ground community examples, both from a city official perspective and then an actual panelist perspective, really invaluable. So thank you so much for that. And we have a couple of questions here that have come in through the chat. So the first one, I believe, is for Alex and Lynn, and a document was shared in the chat, but just so that everyone can hear it, could you provide some information on the cost metrics and data behind instituting one of these processes?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. So these vary in cost widely. As you've seen here, the Eugene panel was a different scale than the Petaluma. I think in Eugene we had something like 36 hours, 38 hours of total panelist work time. Sorry, that was in Eugene, and Petaluma more like 90, and other parts of that as well. Sometimes that depends on the issue, the scope, the just available budget, et cetera. In Eugene, therefore, that panel, if we account for, there was a lot of donated staff time, so that doesn't account for in the actual budget, and I don't think we can ever do that again. But if we were to actually account for that, it would be something like $150,000. In Petaluma, it was more like 400,000. So, and these processes sort of run the gamut, but that's that's a good range for this type of one-time single issue panel. Peggy?
I would just add that had we just done some traditional outreach citywide and hired a consultant and did our traditional workshops and charrettes and things like that, it probably would have equaled that. And this way we were able to utilize that funding to support our residents to come to the table and participate in local decision making. So it's probably some of the best money the city has spent on outreach to date.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And Alex shared a document in the chat. I'll be sure to include that in my follow-up email to folks as well. The second question is more for Peggy, and I must admit I had this question as well, or a variation of it, but how did you respond to those inside government who argue or disagree with the process and the model, saying that we're the experts, or we're elected and entrusted to make these decisions, so why is this process necessary? Why muddy up the waters and make it more complicated? And my sort of take on that was, what was it like to cede over a little bit of power and control to a citizen panel?
Well, it's, when you've been doing it as long as some of us have been in government, the waters become muddied because the voices that do come to the table get so loud that, it crescendos into, World War III at the dais, right? It actually took some pressure off our electeds, because it wasn't just we knew who was going to come to the table. With adding this third piece, now we've mixed it up a lot and said, hey, what does informed participation look like? We know what it's like to have a workshop where somebody says, oh no, let me get my 3 dots in because I know I'm going to vote for, without really delving into it. So this was meaningful. It was informed. It gave us, it reiterated a lot of things that folks already held important about the fairgrounds, but then it also had a different lens. We had folks that I can say that some of our, even though we're a small city, that our electeds had never heard from and we're excited to hear from. I mean, our youth. We're always wanting our youth to get involved, and even in our youth commission, we don't hear from folks as much as we'd like. So this was just such a unique opportunity that I think everybody's a little skeptical, but going into it, I think afterward, I think it was just, I think this is going to be something that the city uses for these more complex, important community conversations.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. And our final questions that were in the chat sort of mirror one another, so I'll just read them in quick succession here. And this would be both for Peggy, but also Jose, you might want to chime in more on this one. How did the recommendations from the panel differ from the input from the open process side of the input process? Or how did the actual recommendations compare with what was being expected or recommended by those quote unquote experts?
Jose, you want to take that?
I'll speak a little bit here about the Eugene process. Again, one needs to think about, if we didn't have a review panel, who would be the typical participants? And the data tells us that typically it's white middle class to upper middle class homeowners. And in the case of the city of Eugene, we were talking about zoning changes for middle housing, which involve rezoning single family home neighborhoods. And so the non-middle housing panel participants, those of the general public, were mostly of that demographic and were mostly against changes to make areas of the city more accessible to a housing type that was not single family home. And that was an overwhelming experience for the non-review panel. The review panel made recommendations to not only change zoning to include middle housing, but to go beyond the state expectations that were being mandated. So it would have been a completely different outcome had the review panel not been set up.
Great, thanks. And this is a question that I had for Alex and Lynn, really. You talked a little bit about sort of the two sides of this equation of who's in the room and what happens in the room. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in the room and what is it about that process that makes it more collaborative and less combative by nature?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So there are a lot of things that make it different, I think, than our typical, more debate-oriented public processes. Lynn mentioned, I think, a little bit in the presentation, this metaphor that we use of panelists really getting on the same side of the table and approaching a topic together. Kind of throughout the first part of the process, we're working to build this orientation towards, really, it's not, any one group of people against any other group of people, but it's an entire panel building that collective identity, facing the challenge together. So we do that in a few ways. We do orientation, kind of onboarding activities that, kind of skill people up in how to communicate in small groups, how to think about, power dynamics at play, our cognitive biases at play, how to have better conversations with one another. So there's kind of that interpersonal process dynamic aspect that we talk explicitly about. And I think that's pretty rare in public processes. And then also there's this intensive learning phase. So really, we ask folks to suspend any judgment they might be coming into the room with. Of course, welcome lived experience and realize that everybody is there because they bring a unique perspective that's valid in the space. But we really hold off on making any decisions or, thinking about recommendations until kind of a set point later on in the process. And we just focused for those first few days on hearing from a wide variety of perspectives, really taking a deep dive on a topic that maybe someone's never heard about before. And yeah, maybe Lynn, if you have anything else to add there, feel free.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add that we did for a short period of time a few years ago a purely dialogue-based program it was sort of an urban-rural exchange program in Oregon, and it was great. Those programs are fantastic. Love it. Fabulous experiences, but the dynamic is really different because I think with a sort of the deliberative project here, which is really a project, it has the sort of natural ability to build dialogue capability without, it's more show don't tell sort of, give folks a project to do together. In this case, gathering and sorting through massive amounts of information and trying to interpret it all together. And bingo, you've already built cohesion on the panel like no other process could do, if you were telling people sort of how to behave or instructing them, which, as Alex said, is of course is part of the project to provide some sort of, here's some best practices of how groups work. But it's really that kind of like work together and sort of us against this problem that I think brings the panel together, and then makes, when we get to beyond the non-judgmental stage into the definitely judgmental stage, when we're actually talking about policy, the panel's built a cohesion with itself. So people don't go at each other. They know that they're all the different lived experiences are coming from and sort of the shared problem they've got in front of each other, and it makes those still difficult conversations much easier. Jose?
I'll speak as a panelist. I think one of the things that jumps out is that it really starts out as a learning process. Even though I'm an academic for my job, I'm not a housing planner. And so I also went through the learning process. And so everyone starts from the same ground. And the breakout sessions at the very beginning set up from what was confusing, what did you learn, what else do we need, what other information do we need in order to clarify our understanding of what was just presenting, but also on how do we move forward. So if you think about these panels as a learning, it starts off as learning. And because you start off as learning, as non-experts, there's a vulnerability to them. And that allows people to, one, be quiet when they need to, but also to speak up when they can, and when it's facilitated, so that those who are being more quiet are prompted to participate. And here, the role of the facilitators is key. And not every facilitator is trained the same way or behaves in the same way, but there really needs to be attention paid to that facilitation so that in the small groups, no one individual is dominating the conversations. Additionally, given that these are longer time investments, this is not something that happens over 3 hours. It is not something that happens over 1 week. It is not something that happens over 1 month. These are individuals relatively small who are working together over multiple hours, over multiple months. So relationship building begins to happen as we engage with one another. And because that relationship building happens, I think it's a little more difficult to be rude to one another. That doesn't mean it cannot happen, right? But it's more difficult because we've invested so much time together on this joint project that all of us, because we're all keep showing up, quite honestly, of the 29 participants who started the panel, all 29 participants finished the panel. So there was no one dropped out. And that, I think, is a testament to the investment and commitment that people who are chosen feel about the duty to serve. And so and that's what I mean in my talk about identity development. Over the time of us gathering together, there is a joint collective identity that begins to develop that speaks to the quality of not only the outcomes that are laid out, but also to the relationships and the potential of those relationships moving forward after the panels end.
Great, thank you so much for those insights and those points. I imagine it's also, you know, when you have a hyper local issue like this, you avoid some of the big flashpoints of national politics, since you can just get down to, you know, solving a problem together. We did have a follow-up question based on, I think, something that Jose mentioned, is how you deal with participant attrition. You know, luckily that panel didn't have any, but how do you continue to maintain diversity and have a representative panel if and when that does happen?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We actually honestly experienced that for the first time in Petaluma, not in a big way, but in a small way. Generally, these panels have an attrition rate of 0 or 1 person. They're very, very low. But in Petaluma, it was very intense, 90 hours over 2 months. It was also the first in-person event that most people had done since COVID. And so there were a number of health-related dropouts specifically, or health or personal family related. About 4, I think, on a panel of 36. So still not high, 4 or 5, something like that. And in general, it's, I think, not, you know, it is very difficult to reselect during the middle of the process, because, as Jose has mentioned, there's sort of a cohesion that's built just by the time spent together and by all the work done together. Yeah, you know, so really there's not a good answer to that. We did a reselection process at one point, partway into Petaluma, just to try to get the number back up to 36 from 31 or wherever it was. And I think it was maybe something that we shouldn't do again. It's a bit of a new thing. And I think it was perhaps, you know, the process, these processes are just different. They're really intensive, and there's kind of no substitute for being there. So I think, and luckily, really, the demographics didn't change significantly from 36 to 31.
Thanks
I
so
should
much.
say, at the beginning of the process, there are alternates, as you would expect, for folks who may drop out sort of between the selection and the first day of the panel. But that's a little bit of a different story, easier to account for.
I also imagine that, you know, you put in a lot of work with things like the stipends and transportation and things like that to keep that attrition rate low, or from even happening. All right, well, I feel like I learned something today, certainly, and I hope all of you did as well. I really want to, again, take a moment to thank our speakers, Alex and Lynn and Jose and Peggy. Really appreciate your time and expertise and joining us here today. Everyone who joined us, thanks for taking an hour out of your busy lives to learn with us here today. I will hope that you will join us for a future webinar. Next month's webinar is going to be on racial equity commissions, so feel free to tune in for that. Again, the slides, recording, and any of the resources mentioned during this process will be emailed out to you hopefully tomorrow. And with that, I'll let everyone go. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a great day.